Shary Boyle is a Canadian artist who works across diverse media, including ceramics, sculpture, painting, installation, and drawing. She maintains a dual practice, alternating solitary studio work with collaborative creation and touring of sound art performance projects. Boyle represented Canada with her project Music for Silence at the 55th Venice Biennale in 2013. Currently, her sculptures are on exhibit in the International Survey Ceramics, Art and Ceramics from Rodin to Shoot, an exhibition organized by the Bonnefontaine Museum, Maastricht, Newfoundland, which will tour to Sèvres, France, and La Maison Rouge in Paris, France, in 2016. The Museum of Fine Art in Montreal will present Sea Change, her sculpture commission created in response to the MFAM Inuit Art Collection in December 2015. Shary Boyle presented 3 new collaborative projects throughout 2015. The performance Spell to Bring Lost Creatures Home with Christine Fellows toured nationally. The Illuminations project with Emily Vey-Duke was exhibited and published by Oakville Gallery Press. And Universal Cobra, an exhibition with Shuvanaï Ashuna, which is currently on view at Pierre-François Ouellette Art Contemporain in Montreal. We are all so lucky to have Shary here as an artist exhibiting in downtown Montreal, as a professor at our school, and now as a speaker. And without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Shary Boyle.
I put this talk together tonight just thinking about the fact that I'm teaching here in the painting department in 4th year, and some of my students are here. And some of the students that I am working with, I don't think have any idea about my work, which is totally understandable because it's now 20 years since I've been in school, right? Anyways, in looking over my practice, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, and I've been working as an artist since I was a child, so there was never really a moment in my life that I didn't identify as an artist. I come from a family of 5 siblings, and I grew up in Scarborough, Ontario, in the kind of deep suburbs, Scarborough. It took a long time to accept that, but I now thoroughly embrace it. But I kind of have since Venice Biennale, which was a huge kind of life-changing experience, and also it came on my 40th birthday, so that also is a huge life-changing experience, and it really is like right in the middle where you're going to ask yourself when those things happen to you, like, what now? What next? And what have I done, and why am I doing this, right? So this has kind of characterized the last bunch of years for me as really deep searching and seeking about why I make what I make and what is the purpose of art and why do we make it. And of course contextualizing that in North America, all the different things that I am. I'm a woman, I'm white, I'm from suburbs, I'm from Ontario, I speak English, I'm North American, all of these kind of larger and smaller contextual details that are really crucial about who I am on the planet and why I have the things to say that I do. But in looking back, I see again and again that I've always been looking for ways to present work that communicates outside of formal structures that the art world has invented for itself. And so I realize that in the ways that I've tried to do that, to make art meaningful, to make art that has social purpose, to make art that communicates and has some kind of value outside of its value, monetary value, or its kind of status value as an important cultural artifact, or all of the kind of class-related things that happen with art that I've always been really suspicious of, I think can be traced back to the fact that I grew up in a working class family without educated parents, and I had no access to arts whatsoever. So growing up as a young artist, as a kid, being a strange kid, doing things that people didn't understand, having no role models, and then going into high school and kind of ending up with punks and misfits, really kind of shaped my politics and shaped the approach that I've always had towards making art. So I started the slides here with this image of me back in, I guess this would have been 2005, on a tour through California with an overhead projection duo with Doug Paisley, who is a musician from Toronto, and we had a 2-person act that we did for a year or 2 together. And I took up with the overhead projector when I was quite young, when I was about 28, and so that would have been, maybe 29, like just before 2000. So 98, 99 was when I started to work with the projector. And for me, it was the ultimate accessible kind of educational tool that was really easy to use and that brought drawing away from the gallery and into sites that you normally didn't access it. So because I'd been doing music as a teenager in high school, and music was a really strong influence in my life, most of my friends were musicians, I was playing music, that live, vital experience of making things with friends, collaborating, and having it happen on a stage where people's responses are freer. Sometimes there's alcohol involved or not, but there's kind of more an immediacy than I was finding in galleries, right? So after OCAD, I had a studio right away, and I was working tons, but I was always missing this feeling of the immediate connection with people where art really meant something. So stumbling over the overhead projector was this amazing epiphany for me of I can bring music and visual art together, and it can be live, and it can be cinematic, and it can have suspense, and it can tell story and narrative, and it can act with lyric, which was always really, really important for me. So over the years of me traveling, I would meet different musicians, and sometimes if I really love their music or I really like them, I would propose a collaboration, or they would propose one to me. So this was with there was Peaches, who was one of the kind of the first person that I ever worked with in Toronto when she was based in Toronto, and then we did stuff in Berlin. Here, that's in Berlin in 2001 or something. So she was kind of the first musician that I collaborated with, and we were just good friends. So to me, it was a natural transition to work together like that. Here's Jens Lekman, who you don't see, who's a Swedish musician, and his work is really beautifully narrative, and that was really fun to do something with him. And then Feist, who is a friend of Meryl's and just people from Queen Street that lived in the same apartment and kind of hung out in the same crowd as I did at a certain period in Toronto. So we were all kind of young upstarts that were just experimenting and really crossing disciplines between music and art and performance, and we were really into costume and kind of improvised shenanigans. And we were feminists, like we were pretty strong, bold women that were actively supporting each other in being fearless. So working with Feist was interesting because it was coming out of a friendship, and I did have a certain connection to her music, but it was also, I have to say, with Peaches and Feist, it was more our friendship that steered me to work with them than a really strong connection that was like totally natively intuitive with the music. Such different music, right? Very, very between the two of them. And here's Doug and I, who, as I said, we were doing Dark Hand and Lamplight, and that was such an intimate thing to present to people, and it was so close, and I was starting to integrate costume and get up on the stage myself and become part of this kind of scene that I would create that would have moving parts and get Doug like right in there and work with his shadow. So the innovative possibilities, too, of working with the overhead projector, which is just like a 10 by 10 inch square, and everything is projected gigantic, but really you're only ever making your artwork 10 by 10. And I always made small work, and I was always interested in the intimacy of small work. But getting to do that small and getting to project it large, but always having it move and be choreographed with the music, that to me and remains still some of the most satisfying work that I've ever done, because of the ability to kind of, when both of those things are done well, music and visuals, they combine into a third thing that's so moving and so electrifying for the brain, because we all know what music feels like. The music that we love, it can move, like it wins the arm wrestle over visual art like any day, right? It's so evocative, so moving, it's so profound. Like very rarely have I seen people cry to art in a gallery wall, but I can, every day I'm almost moved to tears by some piece of music, even if I've heard it a million times. So over the years with the projection stuff, it became my way to continue my work with music and the friendships I made with musicians that I was still involved with, and also sometimes do solo stuff where I just use soundtracks and kind of put together songs like my ultimate playlist, and then made kind of strange choreographed things happen in rear projection, front projection. I started using multiple projectors, but for the most part it was always live, and this was always interspersed with solitary, very quiet work in the studio that had nothing to do with collaboration or showing anybody, being a performer whatsoever. Here's Christine Fellows at the piano, and she often works with different cellists and kind of string instruments, and this was a double projection show in St. Boniface in Winnipeg about the Grey Nuns that rowed their canoes from Quebec to start the kind of French part of Manitoba in Winnipeg. So very interesting history, and it would take an artist like Christine Fellows to focus on that, because she's the only pop musician that I know that will do entire albums devoted to spinsters and nuns and old people. Totally not sexy. So fascinating. So to go into the idea of intimacy and social meaning and purpose for the work, I was always 2D. I was always drawing, painting. That was my private work that I was doing at home. And then the performance stuff was really more public, but had to do with kind of music and bringing art outside of the galleries. But with these little tiny miniature sculptures, this is something from like 2001. So this is like a long time ago, right? Almost 15 years ago, making these tiny little sculpey works. I wasn't showing anybody. They were works I was making for myself. So that's what I would suggest to everybody in school, and something that was incredibly valuable to me as a young person in particular, young artist. Make work that you're not going to show anybody, that you have no intention to show anybody. Whether it's just, we do that in our sketchbooks, but like go further, like make work that's really developed, that you really care about, that you're really putting a lot of energy and resolving, with the idea that you're not going to show anybody, because that gives you such amazing permission to take risks that you might feel way more restricted and too self-conscious to do otherwise, if you're always thinking about the audience, So when you're young, it's different, because when I started out, I didn't have an expectation to be in big gallery shows in my 20s. I was always told, you can work really hard by yourself and develop something to say once you've had enough life experience to have something interesting to say, and develop your practice, develop your chops, and then down the road, let's see what you have to say in your 30s or your 40s, then there might be a depth and interest. And it's a little different now, because people weren't even going to grad school or taking PhDs for art when I was graduating in 1994. So I had the luxury of having a lot of time with no one looking at me and not feeling like I needed to be looked at. And this was really valuable. It allowed me to develop the kind of boldness that I've now feel a lot more comfortable doing if I didn't have that time. But these little works, I started making them, this is a significant jump. This was like 2002, this is 2010 or something, but I started making these works that were just as small as my fingers, the first foray into sculpture, because it was accessible. It was a material I could easily manage. I didn't know anything about sculpture. I hadn't taken any classes at school. I had only done drawing and painting. So I was trying to teach myself a three-dimensional form, and the only reason I got into it was honestly because it was a grieving thing where somebody I knew and loved died, and I was trying to do a portrait of them because I missed them. I missed their physical presence, and photographs weren't doing it. I needed to have some relationship with that person's presence that just didn't exist anymore, and I couldn't get over it. And paintings weren't doing it. It didn't matter. It was a two-dimensional thing. The only thing I was like, I have to wrap my fingers around the body like the body existed in space and time when it did. And there's nothing like touch for, really having a person feels like they're real and present. So I started to make these works out of a personal need to kind of process somebody's loss. And I made them for 10 years without ever showing anybody. I had a strange little cabinet of curiosities in my room where I would just make one, and it felt really good. And it was a really great emotional therapeutic process for me. And then I would just put it away and make one and put it away. And after 10 years, it was like a really weird I even made my own cabinetry case for it. I built my own little case and had a latch on it, and I painted it like a lacquer red, and had velvet shelves in there, and I would creak and open and put it down, creak and shut it, and they were just glowing in this weird. So for me, that, the work is my work. My work is my work. It's for me. It's for my life. Right? And so you better do work that has value for you and helps you get through your life, because you can't trust other people to like it or not. They might like it sometimes, they might not like it other times. So if you really rely on that external validation, we all do sooner or later, especially the more successful you get, the harder it is to fail. We heard Carrie James Marshall talk about that in a lecture in my class on YouTube. And it's good to have a good, solid basis and work that you make for yourself that feeds you. So these little works were just experimentation with detail, and also the intimacy of detail. I'm using dental tools and stuff. The hands are smaller than your fingernails. It's really and never worrying about this being a popular thing to do. It's not really a thing to do, make little tiny figurative, intimate female work like that. There's a lot of not taken seriously that's going to happen from that kind of work. But for me, there's a way of expressing through translating my own personal life into these kind of scenarios that really is satisfying and says a lot more that I can with just verbal story. So those works led into the ceramics. That's how I started. When I first started, after some years with the Sculpey, I never really liked synthetics. I'm pretty into organic materials. I really like paper, I like wood, I like plaster, I like clay. I like things that have a connection to the earth, because I feel like they still retain some kind of power, like earth power, without getting too hippie about it, but it's true. So synthetics freak me out, the rage of plastics. It's super weird. And so doing the Sculpey for years, I was like, I'm giving so much to this material, and it looks like skin. It's weird. It looks like marzipan you could eat. It's got this real intimacy, and I'd be coloring it, and it would but really it was never clay. And I didn't know how to work with clay, and I didn't know anything about clay. So I wanted to work with porcelain, because wouldn't that be beautiful to have something really intimate and delicate with porcelain? But I would ask a few people around, they'd be like, you can never make something that intricate with porcelain, like a slip cast or whatever. I didn't understand it. So it took me some years to kind of circuitously get around to porcelain, and it came through the hobby world. Because I was traveling in like 2002, 2003. I had some pictures of these little tiny miniatures at the time on me, and I was traveling, and I met a guy in Seattle at an art opening who was a ceramic artist named Charlie Kraft, and he used porcelain, and he did Delft. He went to Holland and learned how to do Delft bluing, and he did incredible slipcast porcelain works with Delft bluing on them. And I met him, and I ended up having a conversation, and he ended up seeing these little miniatures, and he said, you would really be into Vivian Housel's World of Porcelain. You should check out Vivian Housel's World of Porcelain, which is a basement hobby class in the suburbs of Seattle. So right away, a basement in the suburb, I'm in. I know those are my people. I know that. I can go there, right? So I met Vivian, who was 86 at the time. I'm sure, I haven't kept in touch with her. It was 15 years ago. I'm sure she's no longer with us, but she was a total firebrand. And she was ringleading this crowd of grandmothers in this lace draping kind of craft freak out scene in the basement. And she knew everything about porcelain, and she had all these like gimcrack tricks that she could do that no like trained ceramicist would ever. She had bounce sheets and like weird things that she was using to like make stuff happen. And she taught me the basics of what it meant to have a plaster mold and how to pour it and how to assemble a figurine from that mold, and the parts. And so she was working with hobbycraft molds, vintage molds, and I knew immediately, I was like so hooked. I took one weekend course and I was like, this is it for me. I'm totally hooked. So it was 2004, 2003. I guess. And I started to make the figurines, and wherever I traveled, I'd try to find those ladies in the basement. And I would take their molds, and I would pimp their molds. And they would be outraged and fascinated, and it would lead to a whole series of amazing conversations with these women who in some ways were kind of like a version of my mother or my grandmother, but I couldn't have those honest conversations with my own family. But with them, I had this kind of bravery through distance to be able to take it on, and we had these amazing cross-generational conversations. So I'm just kind of showing a couple of those works because I want to go through, I got a lot to show you. But it ended up getting really complex, right? I was really interested in the figurine and the kind of history of porcelain and Meissen and Sèvres and like European kind of stuff from the 18th century. I really love the modeling that was happening in the figure groupings there. I went to Germany, I researched it. I was obsessed with the potential that's kind of been lost, like many great artistic skills have been lost. The figurative stuff is no longer really being produced, and also became a mass production thing, which led into a ton of knockoffs and the quality going down, and then it becoming something now that we see in Walmart, and it's a kitsch thing that grandmothers practice in their basement, rarely, sometimes, with the lace draping and the stuff like that. But I thought it was so interesting how it originated with this really incredible wealthy process of the white gold porcelain, and how only men, it was like a domain of men that made these things and sold them to the monarchies and the wealthiest people in Europe, right? So the value system too was very interesting for me as a woman and as someone that's always thinking about class stuff, of the workers, the people that died in the factories, you know, like the little artisanal shops, but like from inhaling the insane chemicals, and the China painting stuff that was the pigments in there, all the mercury, and, you know, the people that were just kind of slaves to the process in order to make the product that was this exclusive thing, right? And then how it ends up through factory processes, which devalues it, and then how it becomes woman's hobby craft. So in a way, for me, that was the really rich legacy that I was playing with these molds. And, you know, Royal Dalton had a little bit to do with it, but Meissen had more to do with it. And mostly at that time, I'd never seen anything like that. So I was just, and it was really interesting to work with stuff that really already existed and then customize it. So I was kind of learning porcelain, but slip cast porcelain in a very specific way. Which led me, after going to Europe and mainland Germany, to be kind of curious about my own family history, like, which is England, Scottish, Irish, real like white kind of islands, you know, and we're the colonies. And I was like, what's the history of ceramics in England? Like, that's an entirely massive thing, because it started in Germany and France, and obviously it started in Asia. Like, it originated, the arcanum of porcelain originated in China, and it originated in Japanese, like all of that stuff was the earliest, right? But then the Europeans figured out on their own how to make it themselves. They were paying too much money. They didn't want to pay that much money anymore. And then the British learned from them, and the secret spread. Everybody did it. So I went to England to see what they were doing over there, and I got a Canada Council studio residency, which was an amazing opportunity, because who would ever be able to afford to live in London for 6 months, like in off London Fields Park in Hackney. And they had a great, really rough studio, and I was, I'm like, I'm going to go to England, I'm going to learn about their ceramics, and I'm going to teach myself now how to make my own molds, because I was getting a little bit sick of using the custom hobbycraft molds that already existed. I wanted to make my own originals, have them cast, and start assembling my own figures. So that was my idea, to go there. But what I ended up doing was this massive paper mural that's maybe 25 feet long, and that's all paper cutouts of individual hand-painted paper kind of dolls, in a way, pinned on top, like hundreds of them. And the tree is pinned on top, and the shell is pinned on top, and there's hanging mobiles. So it became this really complicated, intricate work, and that was inspired because when I went to England, I immediately became, very interested in the class system there that's evident, like, to this day. Very interested in our role as Canadians, as part of the colonies, and the relationship to the history that we have here in terms of class in relation to British kind of the people that stayed in England and the people that didn't, and that were sent off to the colonies or had to go to the colonies. There's very little. There's a status difference. There's a distinct status difference between Canadians, Australians, and English, and we're just talking white people here. We're not even getting into any people that aren't white, that are the colonized. So when I went to London, it just so happened to be the bicentennial of slavery, the abolishment of slavery. So it had been 200 years since slavery was abolished. So they were having all of these museum shows showing the history of colonialism, they're bringing all these paintings out of the vaults of, like, first contact with people. And they were trying to do a little bit of very mild reconciliation with their own role as world colonizers. And you can't go to London without, say, like the Victorian Albert. It's just a treasure trove of the world's culture that's been really taken and put into their own museums. So I was seeing this stuff. I saw a chief from the 12 tribes here in Canada speak at one of these events at the British Museum about land claims, kind of like address a room of people that had come for a fancy champagne art show and say, okay, all of you people, we want our land back. And, like, everybody in the room just, like, like really, like, powerful, hair-raising moments in this that were just this clash of this really important time. So yes, I was still interested in the ceramics, but I had much more important direct things to do, and that was to kind of try to tackle, for me, to make a map of how colonialism works, how from the big picture, to stand back and not name the individual countries or cultures that have been involved, but stand back and look how we continually do it to ourselves and each other. It's just a world history of looking at your neighbor and tribally wanting to take over and take what they have and kind of absorb them into yourself and gain and then move on. And there's, we do this through military means, we do it through religious kind of colonization of convincing other people that they are less worthy than us. And they usually, if you convince them long enough, will believe that and give over their power, or you take it by force through military means or economic means. So I was looking at that system and trying to work it out. So I was making all sorts of portraits of historical figures that were involved, or characters, individual characters that were involved in some of the biggest kind of takeovers, say in the last 500 years. In Europe. So this was on the one side of the mural, and they were all marching, these people and these ways of thought, these religions, these mythologies, these kind of characters that may or may not exist in the kind of sands of time as we imagine them, into this giant conch shell. They were all going in there, and they were never coming back. And that was the way for me. It was like some kind of backdrop in an early animation that just kind of replays itself over and over and over again in a cycle. And but it wasn't enough just to do that kind of installation. I needed to animate it somehow with the psychic kind of quality of what that impact has laid out in the world through the amount of trauma and kind of kind of pain and dysfunction and ill health that has caused everybody in the world since then. And it continues too, because it's happening right now. Like, it's not something that's, that was then. It's happening right now. So it's what we do. And I wanted to animate the effects of what we do somehow. And that was the first time I realized I could bring projectors from the stage and the performance part of my work and figure out a way to sync them with the paper. Like an installation in the gallery, and have them in the gallery. But because I always activated projectors myself through my hands and my body and my motion, and I was doing it with choreography, with the beat and with lyric, I was like, how is this going to work in the gallery? Because no one's there to like turn it on or turn it off. And I started to work with an electrician to devise method of a kind of timer sequencer, which would be similar to how you would, go traveling. Some people go away and they'd have the thing to make their lights go on and off in the house to make it look like they're home when they're not there. Something like that, but that you can dial it in and make it really custom. So this person has helped me make those over the years to my needs, and it ended up being something in the gallery that can sit there and go on and off to kind of animate. You can go close and look at the images, and then it's going to go on, and often you're in the shadow and it freaks people out because they're interfering with the shadows, which is the implication of all our responsibilities, So they jump back. They don't want to be a part of that shadow show. They want to see it, and then it's off again. So, it was just how to make things vital and how to make them alive is something that I'm always wondering about with artwork, static artwork. In the background, you can see a piece that was a companion made at the same time, and that is something I'm just going to quickly read you. This is called Skirmish at Bloody Point. In 1577, this is a little part of history probably most people don't know. It's about first contact with the northern people. On a voyage commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I on the south shore of what's now known as Frobisher Bay, Frobisher himself and his men visited an abandoned Inuit camp where they found a few items of European clothing. What had happened is a couple of years before, there had been another ship. People were trying to find the Northwest Passage. They were trying to find what was going on up in the Arctic. And a couple of years before, this one of the very first ships ever sent out by England, there was a little ship sent out, and 5 members of the crew went on land because they were kind of frozen in and they were going crazy, stir crazy. So they went out on land and they never came back to the ship. So those men were lost, and no one had ever figured out what had happened to them. So 2 years later, Queen Elizabeth sent another boat, and Frobisher, they said they saw a camp on the coast there of these people that they had no idea about these Inuit people at all, and they found a few items of European clothing because already there had been some contact with some other places and some things, early trade stuff was happening, right? But even though the camp was 200 kilometers from where the 5 English sailors had disappeared the previous summer, they assumed that clothing belonged to them. They automatically assumed that this was a devious, like that this was the proof that they had fallen into the ill hands and that they had been murdered. So the English went back and formed a little battle plan. And they went to the next settlement over, and they saw some people there. And these were small family groups of nomadic people that had lived out there for thousands of years and were doing their way of living off the land. So these English, if you could imagine, had like guns and uniforms and boats and things that would have looked to any Inuit person. You know, some if they depending if they had contact yet or not, because many people hadn't had any contact at all so early, they would have looked like a nightmare. Like I just can't imagine what those people would have looked like to them. And then to the British, who had already had a fair amount of first contact experiences with different peoples around the world, they saw them as like tribal, rustic, some kind of whatever you can imagine that they would think of them as. So they attacked them immediately, and 5 or 6 of the Inuit people were killed. And the way 2 of those people were killed was that they just ran and jumped off a cliff into the ocean to escape these terrifying apparitions that had turned up in their village. And 1 Englishman was wounded, and a woman and her infant son were captured and taken hostage back to England. So the English named this location Bloody Point. It's kind of the origins of the British relationship with Inuit people in the north. So this struck me so profoundly, this story. I was so shaken that I had discovered this story through going to the British Museum when I was there and seeing in this bicentennial of abolishment of slavery an exhibition of watercolors by an artist named John White, who was on that boat. And he, in 1577, there's no cameras, he's sent by the Queen to draw the local people and the fauna and whatever, right? So he had done a little watercolor of the skirmish at Bloody Point. And in the exhibition, they had the original amauti, which is the hide, the caribou hide or sealskin hide coat that Inuit people wear for winter, and it's all handmade and hand sewn and incredibly thick and incredibly warm. And the women have the big hood for the baby to go into. So they had the original amauti of this woman that they stole. They took her and her baby. They died on the way to England. Of course they died. They can't live in the germs and whatever, their contact. They had the costume beside the paintings, and the costume was still imprinted with the woman's body. Like it looked like she was still in there. It had shaped itself to her body, and this was almost 500 years later. This was the origin. So this kind of thing, like these stories, they never leave me. And in the same way that I made that other one with the projector going on and off, in that scene, it's going on into daylight. So you're seeing those people jumping off to their death, and the British soldiers with their guns chasing them. It's daylight, and then it goes into nighttime. And daylight, nighttime. And I'm just thinking 500 years of day and night and day and night with the exact same scene happening today, playing itself out. So this was me at the opening in 2007 in London, and it was so fascinating to me that not a single person that came to the opening talked to me about the content of that work. I had an entire opening without no one mentioning once the word colonialism or what the subject was. And everybody just chitty-chatted. I learned too that in London that's actually quite common. No one talks about the art. It's not really almost done to talk about the art at an opening. That was really crazy to me. But for me, I was like, look at you guys, what I've done. We could talk about the history of colonialism. And not that I was really like that, but inside I'm like that. Like, come on, we're going to take it on. There's come on, right? That wasn't going to happen. Anyways, I got back to Canada, and in 2009, I was, to my great delight, was curated into an exhibition with Shuvnai Shuna, who at that time, she had been drawing for, about 10, 15 years by then, and she had a large body of work behind her, and I wasn't familiar with her work. She's working out of Cape Dorset, and Nancy Campbell, the curator, just saw these connections between our kind of world of the imagination and how I have, like, the work I've shown you does refer to history. It's got some relationships to art history and political history. But for the most part, I've generated my own ideas from my own life, from my own imagination, as does Shuvnai. And I think that the works have this incredible sympathy because of that. But culturally, we're so different. We couldn't, so it was a real, like, wild move for Nancy to do that. And people were really shocked because they had never seen what was seen as Inuit art. And kind of a southern, like, white, urban, sophisticate kind of, whatever, right? I'm not, but that would be the comparison or the idea put together. And I think that it was, it was, like, insanely refreshing because it was just so nice to see the work together. They had such a good dialogue. But B, it sparked something off. And for me, it was finding somebody who I felt was like an artistic kin. I saw in her work someone that I felt I could understand that work. I can't understand her culture. I'm not from that place, that relation, that history. I can just understand it from my own outside reading and trying to understand, but I'm not that person. But the work to me was so, like, familiar and felt so good. And I felt for the first time that I, like, that made sense to me, the two of us. But back to the porcelain. While I was in England, I did look at ceramics, British ceramics, Staffordshire, the weirdness of England, the folk, the folk awkwardness. I love folk, like, just applications of, the Staffordshire stuff was talking about day-to-day life and people that were going through small villages and maybe doing performances or what have you. Like, it was really kind of a news item of the day, these little Staffordshire figures. So they operated socially and they had great social meaning for people and they were affordable and they were a whole different thing. And then they had just an unbelievable examples of crazily handmade, like, these are porcelain flowers that were so exquisite, and I met people that had lived their whole lives making them and knowing every flower off the top of their head. They knew all the components of the flower. So if you said, I want to see this type of chrysanthemum, they'd be like, okay, and they knew the stamen and the piston and the way the petals and the leaves went, so they could just make, so these were the kind of skills that, again, impressed me, again, made me so inspired to keep trying to learn this stuff myself. So my first attempts to make my own sculptures, to have them cast, were in Sculpey, because that was my material that I knew is Sculpey. So it's not easy to cast that because it's so rigid. And so I've always worked with people to cast my work. I've done some rudimentary plaster casting, but it's not really my thing. I don't want to get deeply into it. And casting really complicated figurative stuff it's just really hard. And you need somebody that's got, like, a certain type of mind that it's like pattern making in textiles or something. There's, like, a certain mind for it. So I found someone to help me cast this. And this is how I figured out, by working with the old ladies, I kind of figured out, you need to separate the body here and there. And, I kind of figured out undercutting, and that would be the final work of that piece. So that was my first original sculpture that I had cast and assembled. Then I poured it myself, assembled it myself, hand painted it, hand detailed it in the bottom, and then I worked in the beadwork as well. So, and the ears are lace draped. So it's kind of like a slow process of learning these material skills. By 2008, my first show, it was in Toronto, 2006, with the porcelain figurines at the power plant, and that had kind of taken my work out of, like, this really small realm of, doing stuff with music on stage and paintings and drawings at Catherine Mulheron and kind of the punk Queen Street scene into some other form when I showed at the power plant, that kind of validity that happens when you have an institution that actually will exhibit you. And then it was the first time that my work had ever been collected by an institution. The National Gallery collected a few of the figurines. And then as soon as that happens, then other institutions will consider collecting you. And it becomes a small snowball, like small s, in the Canadian scene. So it opened up people's eyes to the work and got them considering this material in Toronto or even some parts of Canada of, like, ceramics. Contemporary art and ceramics. At the time, 2006, there wasn't so much people using that material. So I got obsessed with like slip casting and really complicated, detailed figurative work. And to my great honor, the Art Gallery of Ontario, when they reopened and relaunched in 2008 with the big Frank Gehry architectural design, they commissioned me to do 2 new pieces in response to some really old, moldy bronzes they had in the basement. But the way that works is that the bronzes, of course, were donated by some patron, and the patron then donates money for the renovation, and then the patron wants their work that they donated to be on the floor so they can feel good about the fact that they donated this work, but the work is actually terrible. No one wants to see it on the floor. So they ask a contemporary artist to respond to it so they can make it interesting somehow. So that often happens in museums. And I had the most amazing opportunity to respond to Greek mythology by all these old Italian bronzes of Greek mythology. So I got to do my research into that and get really interested in how rape mythology is so pervasive in that history and how that's such a normalized thing in European museums. The rape of this person, the rape of that person is like the most common subject, right? And I thought, okay, I'm going to make some interventions here about this rape culture thing. So this is called the Rejection of Pluto. And it's my idea that Persephone and her water nymphs and mother just were like, no, that's not going to happen. You're not bringing me down to the underworld. And there was a unification and a rejection of that whole scene. And there's light going on and reflection and refraction back to that, evil force. And I wanted to insert this stuff into the museum so that people that have to go and look at the rape of Persephone can also see the rejection of Pluto. So they can have both of those stories. And they don't have to just see one and have it constantly normalized as a subject that is just a part of our lives and a part of our culture. We can also see what happens when there is a unified and activist front saying no, and that's not going to happen, and this didn't happen. We refuse it. Right? What happens like when you imagine a different history? And that's very powerful, and it can be, it's a really proactive way to work too. So all the small work, of course, eventually was going to lead me to want to do something big, because if you work with all these intricate, super fragile, like lace draping couldn't be more fragile. It is so ridiculous to try to handle that stuff, to try to pack it or ship it or do anything. And if you work with porcelain or ceramics long enough, you will get that feeling that you just would love to go through the entire studio with a giant mallet and like just destroy everything, because it'd be so satisfying because you've like been fitzing, like tiptoeing around for all these years. So I was like, okay. And also because I've always worked with the figure, the poetry of the body to tell stories, I wanted again to feel the body, but I wanted to feel the body like it was a real body in front of me, like I was Giuseppe and Pinocchio, I wanted to like make a person. I've always kind of believed that art is real, that you can make, that the characters, I've always had a strong relationship with the characters I make, like they're real to me. They're my companions in some way. So in that way too, I always love them. And I feel like that's interesting to me because for instance, when I read a lot of fiction and literature, and when I see a writer that writes their characters like they don't really, like you can tell they kind of hate them or they despise them a little bit, it's very hard for me. I kind of feel like I'm not getting as much as I could because you're not using compassion. And you can have a terrible character, a terrible scene, but if there's some bit of compassion, there's so much more depth and wisdom in it. Anyways, how do I learn my materials? Usually through apprenticeship, not through school. I've been out of school since I was 21. So I wanted to work with plaster, and I wanted to make a full-size figure. So the studio that I was in was a huge warehouse, and I kept walking by this plaster shop that did crown molding and restoration for churches and stuff. And it was a guy that was third generation from France, Cannes, France, who his whole family had always done this really fine restoration work in plaster, knew everything about the European methodologies of working with plaster. So I kind of ding-dong. As it turned out, he had 5 daughters. None of them wanted to learn the trade. It was stopping at him. And he was a master, and his name is Jean-Pierre Furiari. And I've worked with him many times in different projects. So he taught me the rudiments of the armature and how to build a really strong plaster sculpture, how someone like Henry Moore or Rodin or something like would make a individual sculpture. But of course we have foam now, so foam always plays a big part in big sculptures, doesn't it? So he kind of gave me the basics, and I worked on it in his space, which was huge. I didn't have that kind of space in my studio. And I just worked on it for a month or two until I was really happy with it, and it ended up being my first sculpture that it's a little larger than life, the arms are extended, and I incorporated the lace that I'd been collecting, all this like antique lace from my lace draping works. So I sewed that into a spider's web that was connected to different parts of her body. And I knew this was I wanted to project on it. So I wanted to have this kind of like European white statuary look. That's something you'd see in the back room of the Louvre, but it would have projections. And so I had to figure out again how to map out the projections in scale, how they'd fit on the projector to hit exactly that sculpture. And it was my first experiment with that. So that piece of Iris is now up at I think it's still up at the National Gallery, and they have it in their collection there. And there's a moving element too, a little fan, a little bat like that moves around when the projection's on, and then when it goes off, it goes back to the original. But this was very important for me to incorporate now sculpture and projection in the gallery. And that would end up kind of being evolved over the years. So here's my tiny little studio in Toronto when I was doing a lot of the sculpture work in 2008, all porcelain, 2008, 2010 in there. There's my molds in the background, some stuff on the side in mid-assembly. And then I finally by that time, had enough of my own originals cast and assembled to create a series of work that was kind of riffing on those earlier figurative works, but more Meissen-like and more kind of stuff from the museums that I'd seen that I admired, but in my own kind of homage, like the lute player, but in the homage to the women musicians that I've always worked with. Stuff around, this is called Family. Burden. So it's getting pretty complex and fragile, but exciting, really exciting to make those things. And I have all these molds, though. I got all these molds, and I'm not making edition works. I'm not pumping out like 10 of these things. They're really one-offs. So it's a weird thing, but slip casting has a certain character in the sculpture that you just can't get through hand building. So I was really loving the slip casting, but then I was ending up with like 1,000 pounds of molds that I wasn't using again. They're really expensive to have made, and I started to feel like, oh, do I really want to do this forever? I wish I kind of could get more into hand building, which is where I've gone to more in the last few years. But that Louise Derry here at Galerie de la UQAM, I hope that sometimes you go to that gallery. It's magnificent, and she's one of the best and amazing curators in Canada. She's such a powerhouse and so poetic and intelligent. And I had the great grace of being asked to do a traveling show with her in 2010. So it came to UQAM here. She organized it, but it also went to the Ontario Gallery of Art, which was huge because that was my hometown. So I got a show at the AGO, and that was a giant thing for me. So I installed in the historical galleries. I installed my porcelains. I had my paintings in the background, and I also asked if I could borrow from their historical European collection to bring some of the paintings that I liked from their collection in and install them with my work. Anyways, I was pretty burnt out by then, pretty tired, a lot of work. And the tour was intense of that show. So in 2011, I had been keeping in touch since I had that first show with Chauvenay, and I'd been keeping in touch with her. When she came to Toronto on her rare southern visits, we'd visit together. But I've always been really geographically and culturally interested in the Arctic, much before I was doing that work in England. And I knew one day I would go to the Arctic, and now that I knew Chauvenay and knew a lot more about the Cape Dorset Baffin Island printmaking co-op that's been operating since the 50s there, I knew that I wanted to go there. I wanted to meet the artists working there. That's where Chauvenay works, out of that studio. It's in Nunavut. It's on Baffin Island. Iqaluit is the capital of Nunavut. Iqaluit's on Baffin Island, and Cape Dorset's just kind of on the southern tip of the island, so it's another flight from Iqaluit. And this is it in February. This was 2011 when I had the opportunity to go up there for 3 weeks and just draw. Because always, too, I've wondered, is there a way that art, and this is something that I asked Rebecca Belmore last week, which was a really intense question to like pounce on somebody because it's so huge. But in my mind, always I'm like, is there a way for us to communicate through art that's cross-cultural, that doesn't involve language? And is there a way to let go of the baggage of that, especially colonial language, the English language, the kind of history of that? Is there a way to build new bridges through image that we invent together as a fresh start? Is there some way to do that? Is there some way for me as a white Southern person with this history of like terrible treatment of all Indigenous people in this country, like, is there some way to go and just draw together, not even talk, and be on equal footing in that language? The visual languages is kind of my first language, I feel. It's a big question, and really too, I just wanted to hang out. So this is the studios, and everything up north, like when you get to the Arctic, looks like this. They're just little hunkered buildings that are meant to withstand like punishing blizzards. And everybody's running around on skidoos with smokes hanging out of their mouths, totally kind of impervious to the cold. And here's some master printmakers. The co-op is now Inuit run, and all the master printmakers are Inuit who have been trained and training each other. So it's a pretty extraordinary scene up there to see people that have these amazing skills and crafts that are producing really beautiful prints, editions of prints. This guy's name's Kavavau, and he's also a great drawer. This is Hukalu. And her graphic stuff is really beautiful, and it was so lovely to sit beside her because she didn't have any English, and I'm not speaking Inuktitut, so it's really just like looking at images and being very quiet, very gentle, very quiet, very peaceful scene. Wind and snow whipping outside, everybody quietly. Listen to a little bit of the CBC from Iqaluit. IT Patuguk, some of you may know his work. He's an exceptional artist that has since passed away in the few years, very sadly from cancer in the meantime. And he was one of the first artists up there who are not looking at European work. They're not looking at contemporary art whatsoever. They're completely isolated and uninterested for the most part in that history. They're generating their own images since the 1950s. So this is a very brief little history, right? So IT was the first person in that group of people that have been working since the 50s that started working from photograph. No one else. Everybody else had working from imagination. And he was like, no, because there's one guy in the studio, Tim, who's a hunter. Like, some people are hunting. Like, there's a lot of still sustenance hunting, but it's more complicated than you think. It's very expensive to hunt. You got to have a skidoo. You got to have the gas for the skidoo. You have to have a gun. No one's doing it in the traditional manner anymore. So it's expensive. So not everybody's hunting. But people really rely on that food, and they love that food because the food that otherwise is so expensive and so awful that they're given in, like, the new capitalist structure of the North is completely screwed. So they're still really wanting that hunted food. Anyways, Tim is sometimes hunting, and he takes a lot of pictures. He's really into photography. He takes these amazing pictures out on the land and then giving them to IT. IT's going through them and selecting what ones that he wanted to work with, and then he would change the color and he would change the composition, and they were really, really stunning works. So I went up there kind of bringing the idea of the mermaid because one of their central characters is the goddess of the sea, which is a mermaid. But the mermaids that I've seen, we've all encountered through Disney or through different European mythologies. I'm never sure what the relationship with Sedna, which is the Inuit goddess of the kind of creator, almost their creation myth is Sedna in the sea to make all the animals that they eat and they survived on. What that had to do with all the other mermaids that exist. There's Japanese mermaids, there's African mermaids, there's European mermaids. Mermaid is this really interesting mythology that's gone back like ancient times, and no one really knows what the origins are. So I thought, okay, that's a good starting point. I brought that up there and started, making drawings of mermaids, and here like a mermaid in an oil slick, right? And these drawings, 2011 when I made up there, many of them are now in the show at Pierre-François Ouellette in the Belgo building, as is this one. So I would just make drawings, and sometimes people would kind of look over my shoulder and go, But no one talks about each other's work. It's amazing. There's no critiques. There's no like, hey, that's great, or like anything. It's just you're doing your own work, just doing your thing. And you have a different system of economy. You're getting paid for it. Everything you do, you get paid for. It's not like, oh, I'm just doing this for myself and my own ego and my sense of like identity. It's like, no, I've got a big family to feed and there's no other jobs. So this is an incredible way to make money. And it's kind of one of the only ways to make money in that community. And people have developed their skills and their imaginations through that. And in some ways it's much more like, I found it much more honest and like clean. It's just straightforward, And this was, when I had that show with Shuv and I in Toronto, she never came down. It's $3,000 to fly between Toronto and Cape Dorset. It's roughly like more expensive than going to like the African continent. And that's why people get trapped up there. And that's why we meet so few people from the north, like, because it's so expensive. Only like government people or people. And I saved up my own money. I did not get a grant. I like to say I did not get a grant to go. I did not get accepted for a grant to go up there. I used my own savings. No one paid for me to go up there. And it was worth every penny, obviously. And I got to meet Shuvani, who's a delightful human being, an extraordinary artist, insanely prolific, really generous, supporting a really large kind of a group of her own family and other people too. Very celebrated artist. So that's, not sure why that guy's in there. Yeah, this is her making a sedna back. We were kind of riffing back and forth on this. This was like us looking at each other's work a little bit. And her always, I mean, she'd been making sedna forever. That's part of her cultural history, right? But I was making some mermaids. She was making, and I'd also introduced her at that time. She came over to the apartment that I was staying at, and we would hang out and eat breakfast and stuff together before we go to work at the 9 to 5 studios. And I was one time doing some research on the computer, and I had all this images of albinoism in animals up, and I was looking at images of all sorts of animals that had no pigmentation, and she had never seen that before. And she was totally enthralled. Like, what is that? And I had talked to her about it because she didn't know any Inuit people that had that condition, so she'd never seen anybody like that. And she's not someone to really watch a lot of TV or go on the internet. She does, like, she watches some stuff ephemerally, but I don't think she's really focused on it, so she's not surfing the net, you know. And then it was really awesome the next couple of days to see this albino sedna. And we made our first collaboration that time, which was by my invitation. I made the bottom of the drawing and I said, do you want to make the top? And she'd had one experience like that where, you know, like it was kind of, she had been brought somewhere to do this huge drawing with another artist in Saskatchewan, I believe. And it was kind of weird. They started on either end and they kind of met in the middle, but they didn't have any relationship with the content. And it was really abstract and just kind of dots and stars and stuff. But, you know, I'm a narrative person. I brought this imagery to her and I wanted to see how she'd respond. And she made this really beautiful drawing up the top that she was quite tentative and then slowly got more and more confident. And that's that work too is in the show. And it's a very beautiful work, and it's just from my private collection. And I paid her for that. That was how that went. That I asked if she'd like to collaborate, and the studio manager who pays every person up there that makes work said, if she wants to collaborate, you have to pay her. And so I paid her to do that. So it was the economy of the place and the context, and that's a whole other like talk about that, and it's really fascinating. And there's some really great Inuit art studies happening here at Concordia. So if anybody's interested, it's not far to find that information. Coming back, I've been working with Christine Fellows out of Winnipeg for about 10 years. We've been collaborating. She became kind of my main musical collaborator. I lived in Winnipeg in 2003 and 2004. I met some really great people. Became a very close friend. And when I came back, we got a commission to do a work for Harbourfront for children. And I've never done anything for children before, but it was a really amazing opportunity. Again, social meaning, purpose to the work. It's not about, for me, you know, is that a good career move to make art for children? Like, do I care? Could I maybe make something that would be very delightful and like tender and super interesting about environmental stuff and people up north and that for kids, and the fun of trying to craft a theater piece, which was so outside of Christine and my experience, how to tell a narrative arc in a story like that was really complicated, and I'm not sure it was totally successful, but it was really wild. It was really something, and we had a sold-out run for a week at Harbourfront, and I had involved other people to help me because the projections were so complicated. We had full costumes. There was a big set on stage. I was running from the front. I was embedded in the audience, like the projection right in the middle of the table of the audience, and then right in the middle of the song, I'd run out through the audience in the pitch dark, like totally blind, and run behind the screen where there was a rear projector. So I'd be doing this throughout like an hour performance, and it was super choreographed, complicated, amazing musicians, really crazy. Like that is a 16-foot ladder. And there's a certain moment in the show where Christine goes around, she's got a head microphone, so she's singing the entire narrative. She goes around back. There's this beautiful percussionist, this symphony percussionist that's doing this incredible symphony stuff, a cello. She's singing this narrative about a story that's kind of building, and I'm running and building this kind of thing on her head. So she has a giant paper thing that I devised to string around her neck and kind of hold solid with a big pole up her back, so she's holding rigid as that silhouette, and she can move her arms and she's singing at the same time. And then I'm running up and down this ladder, gradually getting higher and higher and higher, and there's no one to spot that ladder. And the ceilings are like 20 feet. That's a 20-foot screen. And every time when I got to this point, I think there's one other character that's on top of that last one I'm doing there. One last one that fits in. I'm slotting it into these slots that I devised. And it's totally two-dimensional, and it's on her head, and it's waving like this, and she's trying to keep it like steady, and it's kind of doing this, and I'm scampering up and down to the beat of the music on the choreographed beat to make sure to hit all that and hitting her at the narrative, because each one of those little heads had to do with a line in the song. 5 shows, every single time, just imagining like falling and the whole ladder going and just grabbing the screen like, like just going like all in the audience and suffocating the first 20 rows and like that was what my visuals through every time. And you could hear the audience get quiet. So quiet, because their shoulders were like, oh God, it's gonna happen. Like, it was so, we kind of nailed it every time, but it was never pleasant in some weird way. Yeah, so that's our little theater bow at the end, and it was quite touching with these amazing people to work with and really funny characters we made. So, 2012, I was kind of still really processing my time up in the Arctic and the images that I saw there and the people I met there, and I started to do more hand building, really interested in kind of getting away from the slip casting, so starting to work in these larger sculptures. And then I was asked to do the Venice Biennale, which came out of totally left field and was quite shocking for me. At this point, I want to look at the time. Someone give me a time thing, because I want to know how fast I'm going to have to rush through this. 7:10. Oh my God, really? Maybe we should just stop here. Okay, I'll go pretty quick. Basically, there's like me and my shades with this wicked poster. It was a complete honor and a thrill to be asked, but I was really an unconventional person to be asked, and I knew that my work would not be received in a conventional way. And I had the question to ask myself, do I want to make myself a target with the kind of work I make, which is very handmade, socially conscious, small, not kind of the production values are very one person in a small studio. It's not kind of large scale contemporary art, spectacle art that really works well in Venice. But then I was like, but what an opportunity to say the stuff that I want to say for all the people that I know would never get asked to do this. There's a conduit here that I can take as a responsibility and a beautiful challenge to talk about stuff that never gets talked about, and to bring the kind of outsiders to such an insider event. So that was where I started from. I went to Venice. I wrote kind of a manifesto about the outsiders that I wanted to dedicate this show to, myself included in a weird way. And then I proceeded to make work that was about silence and the good forms of silence, which is the isolation and the kind of quietness that we can achieve inside of our own lives, the solitude of silence when we're born, when we die, the cosmos and the universe that's so mysterious and so utterly silent, that's so exquisite, the kind of spiritual epiphany of silence, and the bad kind of silence, which is when you're shut up and you're not invited and you're silenced, you're quietened, and no one wants to hear you. So I was really interested in those two things, and I was interested in an international opportunity where there was so many languages spoke. I was thinking again, is there some way that art can speak beyond verbal language? So I was making these ceramics and really interested in the kind of sphere as a metaphor for lived experience and how we carry that. And music, of course, that's always been in my practice. So these ceramics were hand-built and very precariously carrying these slipcast spheres and mounted on antique turntables that very slowly rotated in the space. And they were on opera albums but there was no speakers. I wanted the sculptures to look unidentifiable, like not really culturally or like placed. They were my theme for like the kind of aesthetic palette of the show was white and black and gray. So there was no cultural like identity really that I was talking about necessarily. It was just human. I just wanted to try to make something human that everybody would feel welcomed and identify with. But that's asking a lot. That's asking a lot from people that are coming in with a very specifically contemporary art paradigm. I also have a history of being very interested in American Sign Language, Canadian Sign Language, and language of the deaf. Again, a visual language that's incredibly beautiful, incredibly dance-like and physical and choreographed, and a language that I love very much, that I've studied, and I've thought in some ways that at some moments and times in my life that would be a really a career as a second career or an alternate path for myself that I would really love to take, would be a translator and work with the deaf community. So I studied while I was in Winnipeg and in Toronto and got up to a certain level in it. And this was my first opportunity. I used to make Super 8 films. I wanted to make a film for Venice, and I wanted to work with a deaf performer and do it in sign language, which is the ultimate silent language, but with so much soul. So I found Beth Hutchison, who's this incredible woman in Toronto that works at the Deaf Center there. And she does closed captioning stuff, but she'd never been a theater or actor or anything, but she was such a magnificent performer. And we worked together for her to interpret my text, which was my manifesto about who that show was for. We worked together for her to interpret it into sign language, because there's so many varieties of signs that all have subtle distinctions like any translation job. And we had an interpreter. But I honestly... like the interpreter's there in the background, you can see with the red hair, and his name is Will, but I barely remember him because all I remember is Beth's voice, because she has such a strong character. And when you're working with the deaf and you're communicating with deaf people, you're looking them, and you're not looking at the translator and talking to the translator. Like, there's no etiquette in that. You're looking at the individual you're speaking with. And so she's signing, and she's signing. I couldn't understand. It's way too fluent and fast for me. But she's signing, and Will's speaking, but Will's voice just became Beth's voice. And it didn't, the gender, nothing mattered. All I can remember is what Beth was saying and what she was thinking and what she was feeling and her ideas and stuff. And it's a pretty beautiful thing when you can have three people in a triangle like that. And really, Will did such a wonderful job that he is forgotten. So she's, I really had the idea that she was going to be the kind of, somewhat like the kind of spiritual godlike figure of the entire installation, and she was going to direct people and tell people what the meaning of the work was, but she was going to do it in a way that no one understood unless they spoke Canadian Sign Language, which very few people in the Venice Biennale are going to. And I love flipping the tables like that, because it's the deaf that are always left out of our culture, our hearing culture and our spoken culture. And they've devised their own extraordinary culture, which is really interesting and super rich and complicated and political, but like here in Venice, she was the only speaking person. So here's me making the film, and these beautiful still photographs of her interpreting the text. So back to these ancient, again, in Italy, 1500s, these massive, gigantic mermaid sculptures in like old grottos, and me doing like more projection stuff with mermaid, Sedna, which is a stone carving there, and really getting into the idea of caves and grottos and ancient cave art, really influenced by cave art, and the idea of the origins of art that had so much meaning. And there was a point here in European history where art had such a social construct and meaning that was so valuable, and we don't even know what it was, but it was obviously spiritual, it was probably religious. It might, there's so many. And did people know too that 70% of the cave art through France and Spain has been identified as being made by women? Anybody know that fact? This is something in the last 6 months that the National Geographic Society has published through people that study the length of the finger joints between men and women. The hands, there's that really, like all the caves have these hands that have blown pigments. They're women's hands. Kind of changes some paradigms in the head, right? Ancient fertility things. So I'm going into Venice with I'm going to make like a fertility goddess about an old lady suckling an infant. This is not going to go over. This is not going to be cool. And I knew that, and it was not to everybody's liking, and that's just something that I've always done. I've always played in that line where I know it's going to be not really, not so. And then on the other hand, I can't not do it because it's the truest and the thing I have to say, the thing that has the most integrity to me. And also there's that shit disturbing part where I'm from Scarborough. I'm like, I'm gonna fucking put that right in the middle of your art show and see how you like that. So how do you like them? You know, that. Who's gonna be in the middle? Like a nursing old lady is gonna be in the middle of the Venice Biennale, right? Like, ugh. And I also got really psyched of like, I'm going to make the most complicated projection registration problem ever. And then drove myself insane. So that's a little tiny maquette. That's like 12 inches of the figure in plasticine. Here she is, almost 12 feet long as a plaster and plasticine piece that was then to be cast. There's the little infant in plaster and plasticine, the details you can see before it went into the big gigantic waste mold that it ended up being cast from. And there she is after she's been cast. And it's got a seam in the middle of the waist. It was cast in 2 parts. You got to think about how it's going to get to Italy. It's going to be in giant container ships. And, you know, how it can only be so big. And then the hair was all hand put into the plaster. And then she's mounted inside of this giant cave, which was like a theater set, like an amateur theater set, something you'd see in a like creche scene in Woolworths. Which was in my studio, and you can see my studio was only like about 6 inches wider than that thing. And it all had to come apart in tiny little pieces and be packed in crates, so it could fit out the door, but it was like as big as I had this studio. But I really love this. Like I personally really love the combination of what looks like a drawing. Those stalagmites and stalactites are 2-dimensional masonite pieces that look like drawings or paperwork, and like those little theater maquettes, you know. And then you can see the scale of me like scampering around in there in my sock feet because it's all glittered and stuff, and I'm trying to keep it clean with this gigantic plaster piece. But you can see all the seams, and all of that was hidden Hollywood magic for the final installation. This piece is now a part of the National Gallery's collection and is currently up in Ottawa. But yes, the registration of those images, which took me a year to research, and every one of them has a very specific meaning, all about silence, all about heroes of silence, all about the ideas of kind of self-determination that I was so interested in with that exhibit, and the body, and kind of cycles of life. So when there's 3 projectors on her, when they come on, this happens on that figure. And it's quite shocking. And the eyes, which I was really interested in making this giant collage of eyes, looking back at the viewer. Because as an artist, we're always looked at. Everybody's looking at us. But I want to look back at them. Because we're all implicated in this relationship of art, whether we're the viewer in the gallery, whether we're presenting the work, we're all having a conversation. And wouldn't it be great if we really felt as artists that we were truly having a conversation? But at least we can make them nervous, if nothing else. So here you see the projectors. There was people like Helen Keller and Malala Yousafzai, C.J. Julian from the Missing Women Commission in Vancouver. There's civil rights images. This is the woman, this is John White's original drawing of the woman and the child that was brought over to England that did not live. There was animal activism, and then there was the planets and the spheres and the incredible cycles of repetitive patterns that we all find in nature that recur again and again and again, and that kind of give us a sense of some larger significance, that mystery. I'm super into science. Science is like art. It's so interesting. But there's also so many things, like scientists are just like artists. They're always just trying to figure stuff out, and they have amazing imaginations, and there's so much we never know. But there's these patterns that seem to give us clues. So connections. Charlie Chaplin got me through the experience of the stress of Venice, which was extremely, for like a very sensitive, sometimes introverted person. Even though I'm a performer, I'm also kind of introverted. Charlie Chaplin, if you don't know his work, because it's like, antiquated, weird, like whatever, look at his work. It's so profound. He's an activist genius. It's so beautiful. It's so touching, and it's so hilarious. City Lights is one of the best films ever made. And then maybe some people know this very French famous mime, whose name I'm just skipping on, but anybody reckon? Yeah, Marcel Marceau. Very beautiful, a king of silence. After Venice, I have since then just been taking on projects that are very meaningful personally to me, and trying to reevaluate what art means. Why am I making it, and what matters to me? Working again with Christine Fellows, taking on a commission to go up north and travel through the Northwest Territories. And this is what we've been doing this last year. So we've gone across Canada from the tiniest communities in the Arctic Northwest Territories all the way to Vancouver and Newfoundland. And we performed in Luminato and Toronto and different bigger festivals and then tiny communities. So here's us with the ice pilot from Hay River. He's got his own reality show. We were in his weird DC-3. It was super cool. And there's the Northwest Territories, if you've ever wondered what that looks like to fly above. The Igloo Church in Inuvik, which is Arctic Northwest Territories. We performed in there. And then the Winnipeg Art Gallery, so like more classic theaters. And a lot of costume again, and narrative, and incorporating some photo collage. I think that probably came out of the Venice work of all that photo collage I was doing. And because usually I would just do drawings and cutouts in my performances. So that's been a really meaningful and very difficult performance to pull off over those tour stops. I'm just finishing up now. This is my studio in Toronto again, the same place that the Venice work was installed in the back there, but I've since given it up. But I'm here working on a commission this past summer for the Musée des Beaux-Arts, and I was asked to make a sculpture in response to their Inuit collection of art. And they have a magnificent collection, and I was very honored as a non-Inuit person, the first contemporary non-Inuit person that's been asked to respond to that collection. So I had to talk about the history of Northern affairs and the Hudson's Bay Company and the Jesuit colonization of the North. So this piece is kind of featuring the classical mermaid turning into Sedna, potentially a symbol that unites kind of everybody in the world. But it has a complex installation of inside of a glass tube, and it's pretty large, and the work on top is an ice field with isn't this photography unbelievable? Like the Musée des Beaux-Arts brings, like I delivered the sculpture and they bring this photography back. I'm like, oh my God, look at that. It looks like it was done in like, some Los Angeles, like post-production studio for Steven Spielberg. So she's looking up, right? She's looking up under the ice, and the light hits her from this hole in the ice that this little boat is launching onto, and it's really dramatic the way that the lighting goes through. And then there's the little priest launching with the Hudson's Bay, and the military commander who is operating on behalf of the Canadian government to claim the Arctic. These are the people that change their lives forever, and there's no recovery as yet. And yet another collaborator. This is kind of an amazing image to put right after. Look at John Davies' suit. Isn't that nice? It's like a pantsuit that goes to the knee, like a summer suit. And it's really beautiful. He's the curator at the Oakville Gallery. And they brought in Emily Duke, who's posing in that super goofy way, and me in the hee-haw overalls. We are friends. We've known each other for 20 years now, and maybe almost. And we have been collaborating in our entire 30s on drawings and her writing. So we have been just back and forth doing this relationship of her sending me writings and me making drawings, and then me sending drawings and her doing writings to them equally, back and forth for 10 years. And finally, we're like, it's done. And what we really wanted was a book, and we got a book, and we're so lucky and happy about it. And it took us years to get someone to publish it because it's very fierce, it's very feminist, very violent, and it's very hilarious. And that's not a combination a lot of people want to publish. So we had a lot of no's, not a lot of not interesteds. And we ended up getting a patron that helped us make the book with the Oakville Art Gallery. So if anybody here would like to come, there's like a little thing in a minute. There's a book launch here at Drawn and Quarterly on December 5th. So the books are very beautiful, and the writing is amazing, and the project is quite something I'm really proud of. I just put that image there because Oakville Gallery decided to put this massive 20-foot banner of this image outside and it's the public library. And they never asked me. It's my drawing, of course. I take responsibility, but they never said, hey, this is the image we want to do. They were like, this is cool, we're going to do it. And so I came for the opening. I'm like, whoa, okay, right on. This is great. But it's the public library, right? It's really, and there's some deep action happening on this drawing. And so I was like, cool. And how long did it take before they got shut down and they had to take that banner down? And they took it down. I was like, you better fight for this. And they didn't fight for it because they had reasons. They're looking for a new gallery and they need the city funding. They should have thought about that first. But it just took one uptight white guy walking by with a little Westie terrier or whatever. Oh, I beg your pardon. Is that a penis I see on the outside of the guy? And it was down. Anyways, 35 drawing text pairs at the Oakville Gallery. And I'm not even I'll just read one of them. This is one of my favorite texts. The obvious answer. Go back to nature and grow old. Society and youth make us deranged. Don't try to be valiant. No one else is valiant. Emily. Amazing. So all of every single drawing has a story and a poem or a text attached to it. And that was 10 years of drawing for me. So that really was 10 years of drawings going into not showing anybody, just going into a flat file. So here we go. There's your book launch. Come on down. And then finally, I'm teaching here, but I took a week off and went up to Cape Dorset to work with Shuna again. And I've been looking forward to that for years, and I proposed this exhibition to happen at Pierre François. And I got to go back up, which was a really mixed trip because I got to work with Shuvani, but there's a lot of sad things happening up there that were really hard. And so the school's been burnt down by arson, and that was some local kids that did it out of rage and not having enough to do and not enough to look forward to. So that was really hard, and some people had died in the studio, so there was only 2 artists working in the studio where there was about 7 last time. So there was some real, the North is a very hard place, and we don't see it. It's cut off from us, right? Shuvani there, I asked her to take her hair down because she's got this beautiful long hair. She's so hilarious and amazing. She walked me up to leave that day when I was flying. And here's the studio. So there's Tim, who used to take the photographs for IT. He's still working and he's doing extraordinary drawings. And Shuv over there on the table, and me working on the left side. And there's Shuv and I. So what I proposed to Shuv and I was, let's draw together on the same page, but this time instead of you responding to my drawing, you make drawings I'll respond to. So she made a bunch of drawings up there and left half empty. And then I made a bunch of drawings here in Montreal, little studio I have here, and left half empty. And then I brought them in a tube up to Dorset. And we just swapped. And so for a week, we just sat there and finished each other's drawings, and it was amazing. We worked so hard. We had tunes, we had snacks. We were totally having a great time. And we hung out the whole time and had lots of walks. And her imagination is just beyond control. And I got to respond, tell stories through my own drawings. I draw on black ink mostly, ink and wash and brush. So I was really conscious too that she's very colorful with pencil crayon, and I wanted to kind of make it so that there was this really dramatic tension between the black wash and ink and her brightly colored pencil crayons. And these drawings, these collaborations are all at Pierre François Willette. And we're doing a little finissage party too. So it's over December 19th. Maybe I'll send out an email, or it's on my website. I got all this stuff, but come down for some wine, and we'll have a party on the last day. And I'm making my own book. I'm making a book about this work. So all the art will be in the book. So it'll be a nice little handheld thing, small thing. I'm pretty excited about. Anyways, these drawings are just, they blow my mind. I feel like we're really having this conversation, and I don't even know what we're saying, but it feels like we're singing, and it's like a harmonic conversation. And you never have enough to look at. Like when you see her stuff, you never have. So this was like what I was doing in my studio. I made this drawing, and I'd also just seen the Rodin show at the Musée des Beaux-Arts, which blew my mind. And I was really thinking about the European canon of the grand master tradition of the European man and the sculpture of the blah blah blah. And I'm like, Shuvani, what do you got to say about this? So I'm like, here's this lady sculpture that's been locked away at some European museum, and she's got these 2 pillars, and she just wishes she had arms to make some drawing. And then Shuvani slams it. It's so amazing. Like, oh my God, what is that? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle guy with like a werewolf and a big giant woman giving birth to a polar bear. And there's like a world character with like spider fangs embedded into 2 baby heads. It's just like, it's so amazing. Go see the original. Like it's like, where is her imagination? So beautiful. So cool. So there she is, and look how tiny she is. She makes me feel so tall. And this is the show. If you don't get there, I'll quickly go through. very beautiful. So this piece is not up. I was like, come on, Pierre, get this up. This is like one of my favorite drawings. It's called Wiping Behind. It's like the pants are pulled down. It's just some guy wiping his butt in the middle of like the Arctic. So nice. They're like, no, I don't think it's going to go in the show. There's a lot of work in the show. There's a lot of drawings. There wasn't room for everything. Sculptures made since 2011 till now. So there's the finissage date, 2 to 5 afternoon. There's the collaborations installed in the dark room. And then quickly, to finish this up, the work that I did here with some amazing students. Brianna, David, Judy, Julie, and also Susan. There's 2 people from the ceramics program and 2 people from the sculpture MFA. And I had this really great, I was like on fire. It was like I took a drug or something, and I became obsessed with I had to make this work in 1 month. And this is me. I've been making work really prolifically for 25 years, and I still don't learn this kind of stuff. So it's very interesting. I felt at the end of the process that the students I work with hopefully learn more of what not to do than what to do. But all that said, I was really happy I did it, but it was exhausting. And I was like, I'm going to make this giant porcelain hand-built piece, and I'm going to make a really big plaster work, and it's going to get done in a month, and it's going to go in the show. Anyways, there was no room for it in the show. Like there was no room for that in the show, and which is great because they didn't work. Like, so this piece, which I loved, I worked so hard on the sculpting of it, and I was really happy with it. I loved the face, and it was a snake body that was super long, and I had all this beautiful intricate painting of underglazes, and it had a knife in the teeth. Like I'd gone on eBay and like found this really weird old knife that was super creepy. It was probably a murder weapon. Came to my house. It was going to be right in the teeth. It was going to be really beautiful, and here's Susan helping paint it with my boyfriend, even like I pulled him in, painting this, like it took us like 10 hours to do the glazing on it. And there's Julie loading the big gas kiln, and we had to fire it vertically, and then it didn't blow up, but it had massive cracking, which I knew happened because I rushed the drying. So I knew that already. I did that from trying to rush. You can't rush ceramics drying. You got to dry it really slow. And then also the underglazes failed, so I didn't test them. I just had like magical thinking. So you never have magical thinking. It's a science ceramic. So I was like, these underglazes are going to be perfect. And then they look like crap. They look awful. So then I was like, and then I got food poisoning. This was 3 days before the opening. And I was done. I was like down on the mat, down. Like I was trying so hard, but no. So that piece did not work. Here's Brianna helping, and David scored some wicked pool noodles, amazing, armature for the sculpture I had in mind. And this work is survived, and it's crazy interesting, but it's not going to be done. And I brought Shuvani in, snuck her into the basement of Concordia, working in that weird little crit room closet down there. It's like as big, no windows, no air. I was down there for like a month between teaching, freaking out. And I got Shuvani. I was like, Shuvani, she doesn't paint. I'm like, I want you to paint the face. And then I gave her all these different paints, and I was going to give her like a little tutorial. Okay, like here's how you start. I thought like, oh, I'm a big painting teacher now. And she just grabbed the brush and went right in, and like it's like peach face. It's so funny. So I'm painting the body, she's painting the face, and then this is her when she's done. I'm not going to show it to you. That's just her response. She's like, it's like I'm looking at it. This is how it's like. And then she just had that, and I took a picture. It's so funny. So this piece is yet to be finished. It's in my studio, and it's getting completed. And it has hair, it has a hat, it has all sorts of things going on. But it's not going to be in this show. And when I go back to Toronto, I'll be picking up with the porcelain work that I have been doing in this last year, in between all my other projects. This is kind of my ongoing work that I've been doing over the last year or two. Doodle, that's called. So these are all hand-built. This one's pretty nice with the horsehair individually inserted into the eyelash holes. And that's my final piece, which kind of inspired the big piece that I was working on that didn't work. That was kind of came first. So it can be done. It can be done. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. That's a massive talk, so... Anybody have a burning question? Yeah, Brianna. Oh yeah, hold on. Do we give the microphone to the person?
So I'm really interested because you've done so much traveling and you've worked with so many people. What you think about the question of what is an artist as researcher, or if you think that you are an artist as researcher, or if you just completely reject it. I just would like to know what your opinion is on that.
It's interesting because I was here for the last one too, and so I got to hear Rebecca Belmore's response, which is not, I mean, what's that? Oh, well, I will give my response, which was not so dissimilar, because I wonder if it's like, we're kind of like, she's maybe a couple years older than me, but we're from a similar kind of background of like where we come from as artists in terms of lived experience. Like art is lived experience, and it's a response to that lived experience. It's not an academic position. So research, when I think of research, I think of science space. That's a term that is usually associated with science. And I do see how contemporary art has more and more aligned itself with like language around science and language around academic kind of theoretical language, that's been going on for some time now. And that, the idea of people getting PhDs and kind of going really thoroughly into a researched and kind of written form of constructing art, that's obviously valid, and it's going to take a whole bunch of people that are interested in doing that and talking to each other. But it's a very specialized field, and for myself, when I think of that type of research, I think it's personally preposterous for myself. Like, I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scientist. I don't have a white lab coat. But if I'm really interested in a subject, I read books about it. Like, I look on the internet. Don't we all do that? Like, isn't a clickhole basically researching? Like, Yeah.
I guess Sorry, I guess the question about research always continues because we're in an academic context, and you yourself teaching in the program, so it kind of gives you an idea.
Yeah.
But I always found it funny because
Hello. Yeah.
I find it funny because last year I came from Scarborough, Toronto as well, so like Scarborough all the way.
That's nice.
So,
my countrymen.
Yeah. Thank you. I didn't actually know that you were from Scarborough.
Deep Scarborough.
But we always talked about research creation in terms of Concordia because that's like a big topic, research creation. And that kind of, like, all I was taught in my undergrad was theory and practice. So it's like these things you have to kind of embed. But I always found it funny that research creation, and even the courses here, there's artist as curator, artist as researcher in terms of the graduate program. So they're kind of mentalities that are trying to not spoon feed you in terms of like, this is what you have to be, this is what you have to be. But even when you just started talking about that, it's a personal space. Who is the biggest critic? You yourself can be in some ways. And the idea of just producing work in silence, I think that's amazing. Like, the one thing we forget to do is we need reassurance of some sort, but being silent and being preserved introvertly is kind of a difficult thing to do.
I want to talk to people that aren't artists. I want to talk to artists. You have to talk to your peers, but I want to talk to people that aren't artists. And I don't want to denigrate or devalue their experience by only talking in a specialized language that only my peers can understand. And I think that art becomes more and more an island in itself that doesn't relate to people, the more we only speak a language that only each other that have had that exact same education can understand. Because then what value is it doing for society or community or anybody else? What value is it doing? They go into a gallery, they don't understand it, they feel intimidated, they feel stupid, and then they go away. Or people conversely look to art to make themselves feel more intelligent. Oh, I understand it. This is my insider understanding. I'm very intelligent. So then you're seeing people that's all they're getting from art, that kind of inside joke or the inside feeling of like, I belong to this exclusive club, which I also disagree with, because that is all about monetary status and the value of art being like this kind of exclusive thing for the very educated and wealthy. So I don't know, because I'm also caught on the fence because I come from a working class background. I'm a maker. I want to do things with my hands. That's all I really want to do. But I'm also, I don't want to be an anti-intellectual. That's like not a good position to be in, right? So you do want to always keep your mind curious and open, but there's so many sources to learn from. I mean, I don't know, like the work has to be vital, it has to be meaningful, it has to have some kind of idiosyncratic originality in order for people to recognize it and go like, yeah, there's something real in that. Like there's something, like, do you think that anybody is researching up in the north? Like that's not a research practice going on up in Cape Dorset, but some of that work is so beautiful. It's so moving to me. You know, it's so graphically beautiful. It's like composition and color is really magnificent. So they've got these chops of being able to lay out a drawing or a painting in a really extraordinary way that's really good, like just solid and intuitive, but it's coming out of a tradition that has relationship to textile design, that has relationship to beading, that has relationship to the way that people are looking at the land and the horizon line of the geography. It has all sorts of intuitive intelligence, but also historical learned intelligence of like a culture that's ancient. It's informed by all these different various things that have nothing to do with contemporary art text or modern art text. And also it's so Eurocentric. Like, so I question that stuff too. It's like, well, what's your research like, and what context is it coming out of? But all that said, I mean, I went to Germany to research Meissen porcelain. So I went and looked at the collections, and I went and read up on the people that were making the sculptures, the real people that were making those sculptures at that moment, and who worked in that factory and who was making them. And that's very fascinating historically. And I would do that whether maybe I was an artist or not, just because that's really interesting. The same way that I'm really interested in orangutans in Borneo. Really. So I'll look very deeply into the history of that and the activism around trying to save that species. Like, maybe I'll never make work about it, but I guess I'm a researcher. Like, we're just curious. You know, we're curious people, and you should be if you're an artist, I think, or anybody, right? But yeah, I don't necessarily, I think that art is valuable when a lot of different sources outside of art makes its way in. It's more connected to the life. Anybody else? Enough said, eh? One more question, and then we'll have go have a drink. Yeah, of course. My neck is getting a kink from looking up there.
Yes, okay. Sorry. Louise, I just want to say something about Louise Derry because she will be happy to that I say that.
Cool.
Louise Derry is a very special curator because she is able to look the devil in the eyes and have a sympathy for his loneliness. But you talk about compassion later, so I would like to know, because you said that some you do think deep and might be looks like darkness, and you talk about compassion around between this. So I would like to know. Sorry for my English.
It's okay, I understand.
Okay, I would like to know if you when you expose people or altruism, helpfulness, or they are more individualist with you.
That last part's going to have to be translated. Yeah. Can somebody translate that?
They are altruism or individualism. People when you.
Is my intention to be altruistic, or do I identify with?
By people are with you altruism or individualism. Are people with you altruism? Yeah.
What do you mean, people with me? Do you mean is my art or my intentions in making the art?
Yeah, your intention.
Is it intention to be altruistic or to kind of show myself as being part of that too? Do you mean?
Yeah, about. Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's just it's one of those questions. I'm sorry that I don't speak French, because if I spoke French, I'm sure you'd be able to give me like a very nuanced understanding of what you mean. I think it might have something. I think I've been asked a similar question. Like, if I identify with the characters or the subjects that I'm putting out there as like myself too, or if it's something I'm doing almost educationally to bring attention to something in order for, like, because of in an activist kind of way.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, but example, people don't think about autochtone like you're a kind of helpfulness about this community. So people in the art are more like individualism or like they are helpfulness it's an art to help. Do you do an art to help? Or
Is
you
my
do
art
just an art, genre?
Absolutely, I am. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely feel I have a strong sense of duty as a person and also as a privileged white person and very conscious of class stuff and power dynamics. That if I love something, if I'm a fan of something, I'm going to say it out, whether that's a popular thing or not. So I feel that we should support each other. You know, I think if you like something, you should say, I love that person's work. They're amazing. You know, and even if that, like, I think a lot of people in the arts are really afraid to put their foot out and to kind of step behind something because maybe it's not the right career move, or it might, it's not really a good position to be a fan, or that maybe like, what is the benefit to me if I show with Shuvani Ashuna? She's, shouldn't I be trying to show with like someone like David Almed or like someone that's in New York and really like a hugely, really successful person that I also love and admire, But through me working with Shuvani, I can share some of my resources. I have access to other audiences that Shuvani doesn't. People can look at Shuvani or some of the work from the North like it's some kind of, like it's on the side. It's separate from us. It's a kind of cultural novelty. It's a tribal kind of outsider work, or like kind of primitive or something like that. Whereas I say, it's amazing art. It's really excellent art, and I'm not going to make those distinctions. I'm not going to make those boundaries. And if I can put that work with mine so that people who look at my work will also have the eyes to look at hers, and people that look at her work will look at my work in a different way too, because they look at her work without those structures of contemporary art, which I find so limiting and so often don't get such superficial readings. I've had such superficial readings sometimes in the contemporary art world. Like it's like they're not intuitive. They're not using their whole body and their holistic sense of all the senses to feel identity and to identify with the work and to have a tenderness or an openness or a depth of reading. It's just conceptual. It's just about the trends and like what's happening right now in the contemporary art world and whether you're hitting that mark or not. Are you in the dialogue? Are you in that? Are you having that? Like, but that stuff with Shuvani is human. Right? So it's like, what is our shared humanity? To do that, and also, like, say, for instance, working with Beth and showcasing kind of sign language. That's not a language a lot of people are expecting to see so much, and it's also in a culture of, like, disability or something like that. Like, oh, that's disability art. It's like, no, it's just incredible choreography. Look at the legacy of the inventiveness of that language. Look at the incredible, moving, delicate, detailed nuances of that physical language. Look at the expression, the grammar that's in the expression. You can't get away. We hide our feelings. Deaf culture, you can't hide your feelings because you have to, part of the language happens on your face. And it's really hard for hearing people to learn sign language because we are so schooled to repress our expressions, because it's so embarrassing to reveal our inner selves. It's so not cool, And so sometimes when people see deaf people, they're like, why are they so expressive? It's embarrassing. But they're honest. Like, it's like you're looking at honest people expressing their honest feelings about their honest subjects. That's profound. That's so much more advanced than us. So to me, I see advanced stuff that's so human and so important, that's really relevant to humanity and people, and it's art. So yeah, I guess it's like altruism. I don't know. I don't really think so. I just think this is really interesting. This is so much more interesting to me. It's innovative. We don't see it. And, in the context of like whatever, that I'm in this small gallery context in Canada or something like that, the subjects. I just want to have a larger conversation with people. I usually always am the person at the party that gets too heavy. I always, I got a really good sense of humor, but I'm going to back you into a corner. I'm going to ask you some really personal stuff. You're not going to be comfortable. So that's like what I want. So I'm like hungry for that. So, I identify. I mean, I'm going to do a work about feeling like an outsider in Venice because I feel like an outsider in Venice. Because I feel like an outsider in my life, It's and many people do. It's a common experience. So I hoped that people that do feel lonely and do feel outside would come to my show and feel welcome, like this was their place to come. It worked for a few people. So shall we have some snacks and drinks? Thank you.